Today, we're doing something a little different. We are cracking open a time capsule from 1997 to look at how scientists were trying to solve some of the biggest puzzles of our work lives. Things like what makes a good leader, how do you hire the absolute best people, and does all that workplace training we have to do actually work? Let's get into it.
We've all felt it, right? You walk into one office and there's this energy, this buzz. Things just seem to click. Then you walk into another and it feels, well, like a struggle. Turns out there's a whole branch of science dedicated to figuring out the why behind that feeling.
And that field is called industrial and organizational psychology, or IO psychology for short. You can kind of think of these folks as workplace detectives. They use science to figure out what makes us all tick at work. And our guide today? It's a fascinating research report from the University of Colorado at Denver, straight out of 1997.
So here's our game plan. We're going to look at what this 1997 research had to say about power dynamics, how to hire fairly, the tricky business of finding the truth, how to make training actually useful, and then finally, how all this science jumps from the page into the real world.
Okay, our first puzzle is a big one: power, gender, and influence. Back in the 90s, researchers were really digging into why female managers often seem to face a tougher road to advancement. And they basically had two competing theories about what was going on. So on one side, you had the social role model. This was the idea that traditional expectations for how women should act just didn't line up with the assertive, direct behavior that people expected from a manager. But on the other side was the structural model, which said, hang on, maybe the problem isn't gender at all. It argued that the real issue was the workplace structure itself. Who has the power and who gets the opportunities?
So how do you test something like that? Well, the researchers set up a pretty clever experiment. They had students watch videos of a manager. Now, the manager's job title and power were always the same. The only two things they changed were the manager's gender and whether they used a direct or an indirect approach. This was a great way to isolate what was really influencing people's perceptions.
And the result? It was crystal clear. The manager's gender didn't make a difference in how they were rated. What mattered was their tactic. Managers who were direct were seen as more effective, plain and simple, whether they were men or women. This was a huge point in favor of the structural model. It suggested that when you give people equal roles and power, it's their behavior, not their gender, that truly counts.
All right, let's move on to our next puzzle, and this is one that every single company on the planet has to deal with. How do you hire the right people? It's such a high-stakes game, and making sure you do it fairly is every bit as important as getting it right.
So the traditional way of doing things was simple. You just hire the person with the single highest test score. The problem is, this can accidentally filter out really great candidates from certain groups. So an alternative idea started gaining steam, and it was called banding. The whole idea was to admit that no test is perfect, and to treat scores that are really close to each other as basically the same.
But here's where these researchers made a brilliant move. They said, let's not just create bands based on the test scores. Let's link those bands directly to how well we predict someone will actually perform on the job. Suddenly, the goal wasn't just finding the best test taker, it was about finding the best future employee. This made hiring not only more fair, but way more focused on what really matters. Who's going to be great at the job?
Now for a puzzle that's a bit more behind the scenes. It's about the science of research itself. See, a massive challenge for psychologists is getting people to give honest answers, especially when you're asking about sensitive stuff like drug use or their real attitudes on a controversial topic. People tend to say what they think they should say, not the actual truth. So how do you get around that? Well, back in the 70s, researchers came up with this really wild technique called the Bogus Pipeline. What they do is hook participants up to this impressive-looking machine and convince them that it was a flawless lie detector. The hope was that this bluff would scare them into just telling the truth. And they really sold it, too, telling people the machine was practically infallible. I mean, can you imagine being hooked up to that? But the big question for these 1997 researchers was, did this whole elaborate show actually work? Well, they ran a big analysis of all the studies and found that the results were kind of mixed. The Bogus Pipeline did make people fess up more about smoking cigarettes, but it had zero effect on what they said about drinking alcohol or using marijuana. It's a really great reminder that getting to the truth in research is always more complicated than you think. Okay, next puzzle, workplace training. We have all sat through a training session where a week later, we can barely remember what it was about.
In 1997, researchers wanted a better way to figure out if training is actually effective or if it's just a huge waste of time and money.
The old school way mostly just measured reactions, asking people if they liked the training. But by the 90s, the thinking was, that's way too simple. The new approach was much more precise. It focused on measuring the type of learning that happened. So cognitive, which is what you know, affective, which is about how you feel or your motivation, and skill-based, what you can actually do. This gives you a much richer picture. A team might love a training, but if their skills don't actually get better, you know exactly where the breakdown happened.
And this brings us to our final puzzle, which is maybe the most important one. How does all this cool research actually make its way into the real world? At CU Denver, the answer was their Center for Applied Psychology. It was designed to be a bridge between the lab and the workplace.
And this wasn't just theory. They were really out there doing stuff. They were helping a local veterinary hospital with their customer service, evaluating programs for the state of Colorado, and even working with the U.S. Air Force Academy to assess their curriculum. They were taking these big scientific ideas and using them to solve real, everyday problems.
And that was really the whole point. All of this research into leadership, hiring, training, all of it, was driven by this one central mission. It was about using the best, most cutting-edge science to make work more productive for companies and, just as importantly, more effective and more satisfying for the people doing the work. So as we close this 1997 time capsule, it kind of leaves us with a big question to think about. I mean, the technology in our offices today would look like science fiction to someone back then. But the fundamental human puzzles, how to lead well, how to build a great team, how to help people grow and learn, have those really changed at all? It seems like the science of work is a puzzle we're all still trying to solve, together.